Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Henry Marshall Tory Lecture. My name is Luca Vanzella, and I am past president of the Friends of the University of Alberta. We're very pleased to have Arno Kopecky here this evening to present this year's lecture. I'm going to take a few moments to tell you about the Friends, tell you about Tory himself, and then introduce our speaker. So established in 1943, the Friends is a group of volunteers that have a mission to build and nurture a community that celebrates and champions the University of Alberta. We work to encourage connections between the university and the broader community. I'd like to highlight a few of the initiatives that the Friends undertake. So since 1956, the Friends have presented this lecture series, the Henry Marshall Tory Lectures, free public lectures featuring renowned speakers to engage the broader community in front-of-mind topics. The Friends over the years have endowed a number of undergraduate scholarships, as well as a major graduate student prize. And we are very proud to support two programs that are run by the university that connect the broader community in unique ways. One program is called U-School, and this program is run by the University of Alberta Senate, which introduces students in grades 4 through 9 from socially vulnerable Aboriginal and rural communities to the University of Alberta by providing them an on-campus experience. The other program we support is Humanities 101, and that's a program run by the Faculty of Arts that offers free, non-credit, university-level courses for Albertans with a passion for learning, but whose circumstances have certain barriers that make post-secondary education inaccessible. And as the Friends approach their 8th decade of service to the university and the community, we welcome anyone who is interested in the U of A to join us. There's no prior connection to the university that is required. All you need is an interest in this institution. There's no membership fees, and we don't solicit donations. Being a friend, you will be the first to receive notices of events that we are holding. As you may have seen on the screen, if you want to find out more about our initiatives, you can visit the website at friendsoftheuofa.ca, or you could follow us on Twitter at Friends of U of A. And that's how you could stay connected to what we do. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the lecture series. This lecture series is named in memory of Henry Marshall Tory, the Dean of Canadian Educationists in the first half of the 20th century, and the first president of the University of Alberta, having essentially created it from nothing in 1908. Tory's legacy in Canadian education and research is vast. Besides the University of Alberta, Tory was also principal founder of what are now University of British Columbia, the Alberta Research Council, the National Research Council, and Carleton University. Tory was a man of his times and exactly suited to his period in Canadian history. Teacher, preacher, philosopher, man of action, conspicuous scientist. Without leaving treatises or formal scientific contributions in papers or memoirs on specific research, he was a great missionary and proponent of research. And he contributed greatly to the adoption of science to his country's needs. Without leaving any formal dissertation of philosophy, he was a philosopher of education. And without having served in any legislative hall, he became Canadian statesman at large for both science and education. He was a great initiator and founder of learning institutions designed to last. And now we'll move on to this evening's Tory Lecture. And just a little bit of housekeeping. This talk is being presented online, in person right in this room, but also online, live stream to an online audience. So for those that are watching this event on Zoom, you may wish to use speaker view versus gallery view just to avoid a lot of blank tiles in front on your screen. And we're going to use the chat function for questions. If you have questions for the speaker, You can type them into the chat, and our behind-the-scenes volunteers will accumulate the questions that are going to be asked at the end of the talk. And we're going to do a mix of Q&A at the end between online and in person. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. About a year ago, Canadian journalist Stephen Paikin interviewed this evening's speaker, and he began with this. There's a pretty powerful consensus that urgent action is needed to confront climate change. There is, however, equally widespread attachment to the standard of living we've got that relies so much on what's causing climate change. In effect, we've never had it so good, even as it's killing the planet. A few months later, political commentator Jon Stewart delved into why the Earth's climate is changing and why we're not fixing it fast enough. Stewart said, it's easy to demonize fossil fuel companies. The truth is, they've actually literally been the engine of our progress over the past few hundred years, and we are as addicted to them as they are to us. Climate change is an unintended consequence of our success as a species. And as Jon Stewart said, we're crushing it right now. Humanity is crushing it. But you might ask yourself, who's crushing who? This evening's talk, The Tyranny of Freedom, delves into this paradox. So Arno Kopecky is an environmental journalist and author. He draws on 2 decades of reporting to tell stories that illuminate this dramatic moment in history, a time when the interactions between society and the living earth are a key driver of events at every scale. In the stories he tells, the natural world is more than a backdrop of human affairs. It's a central character, influencing everything from federal elections and corporate strategies to family plans of young couples. Arno's work regularly appears in the pages of the Globe and Mail, The Walrus, and numerous other publications. He's also the author of 3 books, The Devil's Curve, The Oil Man and the Sea, and the most recent book, The Environmentalist's Dilemma, which served as a backdrop for bringing him here to deliver tonight's talk. So please help me welcome Arno Kopecky.
Okay. All right, can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, I'm gonna move this out of the way because I'm using a different mic. Thank you, sir. Beautiful. Thank you, Luca, and thank you to the Friends of the University of Alberta, and thank you to everybody who came here tonight, whether you're here in person or watching from afar online. There's a lot of friendly faces, I think, in both of those audiences, and I don't take it lightly. I really appreciate you spending some time with me tonight. It's a real honor to be on the stage speaking to you tonight. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here on Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional and ongoing home of the Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Iska, and the Nakota Sioux First Nations. Edmonton is also a Métis homeland and host to one of the largest Inuit communities south of the 60th parallel. I also want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements themselves are a matter of some controversy. And this controversy is relevant to my subject tonight, which is the tyranny of freedom. First Nations, after all, were the first peoples in Canada, what is now known as Canada, to be subjected to this particular version of tyranny. They know it very well. And I should clarify here that what I'm talking about is the tyranny of those who wish to be free to do whatever the hell they want. Anyone who's raised children also knows about this kind of tyranny. It's a real doozy, but I'm not here to talk about children or parenting. I'm talking about what happens when adults cling to this particular interpretation of freedom, which is something we've been hearing quite a lot about in the news lately. So over the next hour or so, I'm going to explore this phenomenon from an environmental perspective. I'm an environmental journalist. And my goal for tonight is to give each of you a pair of magic binoculars that allow you to see current affairs through an ecological lens. And once your eyes adjust to this strange filter, My hope is that you, like me, will see how much of the cultural pandemonium of this moment in history is rooted in ecological collapse and the widespread denial that any such collapse is happening or that it's something our society needs to worry about. By the time we're done, I also hope you'll agree that it's not too late for humanity, or even just Alberta, to bend this disconcerting curve that we're on towards a more promising and inclusive future. And in fact, that this process has already begun. All of which to say, don't worry, I'm not here as a prophet of the apocalypse. So what does any of this have to do with the controversy around land acknowledgements? Land acknowledgements are a relatively new phenomenon. They only became widespread in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think at first they were greeted with a sort of bemused appreciation or maybe a roll of the eyes, depending who was listening. I mean, there's an apology buried in the heart of these statements. Sorry for stealing your land and paving it. And what could be more Canadian than saying sorry? I have to be careful here. I'm not Indigenous. I don't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of these statements, and I can't speak for anybody who is. But I do think that it's fair and important to acknowledge what many Indigenous leaders have been saying in recent years, which is that it's a bit galling to hear non-Indigenous people like me acknowledge that they're standing on stolen land and then just carry on with the rest of their talk as though that's the end of it. It's sort of like inviting a bunch of friends over for dinner, and right before you serve the meal, you say, look, guys, this house that we're in, my grandparents actually stole it from a sweet family. I don't know how they're doing or where they are. I hope they're okay. Let's not let that get in the way of a good meal, though. Supper's ready. Let's enjoy. I'm bringing this up because the issues at the heart of the truth and reconciliation movement are intimately bound up with the concerns driving the environmental movement. Colonization was all about land, about who owns it and what they get to do with it. The ecological crisis unfolding around us today is a direct consequence of those land management decisions. These are two sides of the same coin. Don't worry. And okay, spoiler alert, I'm going to be saying don't worry a few times tonight, which is usually a pretty good indication that there's actually a lot to worry about. And there is. But one of those things is not that I'm here to denounce the University of Alberta or Canadian Settler Society. I'm also not about to demand that you give up your cars and renounce the wonders of modern technology. I'm a product of all of these things, and I love them too. The fact that one of the most prosperous, equitable, and free societies in the world, by which I mean Canadian society, was built on the proceeds of a dark crime is as fascinating to me as a journalist as it is troubling to me as a writer, as a citizen of this country. Now, it's worth noting this story is as old as humanity. Canada is not the first country to go through this. But if it's not simply enough to simply take note, then what are we supposed to do? Well, that's where things get interesting. Because, of course, there's no one correct answer. What there is a multiplicity of flawed attempts to rectify the situation, to atone for the wrongs of the past and correct the ongoing injustices of the present without derailing the many good things that we've accomplished along the way. And one of the things I take heart from is the fact that a lot of people, including, I'm sure, many people here tonight and watching tonight, a lot of people are trying very hard to make things right. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that our collective future depends on the success of that project. Because exactly how we as a society engage with truth and reconciliation is, to me, another way of asking how we should respond to climate change and an ecological crisis whose dimensions are almost too staggering to contemplate. That question is tearing society apart right now, not just in Alberta or even Canada, all around the world. And that debate takes a lot of different shapes. It's often disguised as an argument about something that seems totally unrelated to the environment. Anyone who's ever been in a long-term relationship knows about this phenomenon. You know that a lot of your arguments are superficial and even misleading. You're not actually arguing about how to load the dishwasher or whose turn it is to cook dinner or what's the best route across town in rush hour. What you're arguing about is whether you feel trusted or understood or loved. And in a similar way, I think a lot of these huge public fights that we're having right now about stuff like pipelines and indigenous sovereignty or carbon taxes and inflation, or that annoyingly sanctimonious language of the radical woke left, perhaps you're familiar with it, it's come for me too. What we're really arguing about is freedom. We're arguing over who gets it and what they get to do with it. And that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. So part of the significance of me being here for me tonight, speaking to you from this stage, is that I grew up about 8 blocks away from here. This is my home. My father taught chemistry right here at the University of Alberta. I spent a lot of my childhood roaming around this campus. It was the first place I really felt comfortable getting lost because I always knew I'd find my way back home. And looking back, that actually seems like a pretty good paradigm for education. But of course, at the time, I was just interested in finding quarters under the snack machines or sneaking into the Butterdome to play on the crash mats. So I'd like to share a quick origin story of how that came to be, of why I was born here in the shadow of the U of A, rather than in Europe, like all of my ancestors going back thousands of years. And I promise this story is relevant to the subject at hand. It begins with my parents, and they're in the audience right now. I'm sure they'll correct me if I get anything wrong, right? My mom, Rita, was born in a small German village in 1940. One of her earliest memories is of rushing out of the house with her family during an air raid at the end of World War II. They heard the sirens go off, and they were running for the nearest bomb shelter, but they didn't make it in time, and so they had to dive under a pine tree, and they hid under the branches of this tree while these bombers flew low overhead. You know, my own daughter is now just a little older than my mother was then. I think about that story sometimes when my daughter points at a low-flying plane and calls out with delight. That's progress. My mother moved to North America at the age of 20, and it wasn't until then that she heard about the Holocaust. I remember when she told me that. I remember it just seemed crazy. I was a teenager, and I was just starting to ask questions about my heritage. But then it wasn't until I grew up a little bit more, and I realized it wasn't until I grew up that I really started learning about residential schools, which were running the whole time that I was coming up in public education. It wasn't until I was an adult that I started to learn about Canada's own dark secrets that had been hiding out in plain sight for ages. My father was born in Czechoslovakia, next door to Germany, in 1932, to a Volksdeutsch family. That's a family of ethnic Germans who spoke both German and Czech. They emigrated to Iowa when my dad was about 2 years old. So my father grew up in a corn farm in the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression. He was 8 when the war started, and some of his earliest memories include watching his father, who didn't smoke cigarettes while he read letters from his family who stayed back in the old world. As the war dragged on, he would read these letters and just be increasingly stressed. And my dad remembers the constant stress on his dad's face in those times. And when my dad grew up, he traveled to Europe to visit some of those relatives who had survived the war and who had stayed back. But they were no longer in Czechoslovakia. They were living now as refugees in Germany. A lot of people don't know about this, but one of the biggest acts of ethnic cleansing in history happened right after World War II, when about 14 million ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsch, were kicked out of Eastern Europe at the point of a gun. Many were given just a few hours' notice before being loaded onto the very same trains that had previously, just months earlier, sent millions of Jewish peoples to their death in the concentration camps. Only now, these same trains were going the other way and sending these Volksdeutsch into a shattered Germany that was entering a post-war famine. And this colossal forced displacement was largely ignored by the international community at the time and is largely forgotten to history, because who wanted to feel sorry for the Germans in 1946? But I have a great interest in that awful historical act. I see it with with great bias as an example of how good things can come from bad things, because one of the products, one of the outcomes of that ethnic cleansing is me. My dad's family had wound up in the same village where my mother lived, and so when he was on that visit, that's when my father met my mother. And then eventually they married, and he took a job teaching chemistry here at the University of Alberta, and that's how I came to be born and raised a few hundred meters away from this room that we're in. Unlike my parents, I was gifted a totally normal, peaceful, middle-class upbringing with no trace of the violent geopolitical hurricane that blew my parents across the planet and dropped them here. I'm grateful that my parents are alive today. But my appreciation is not just that of a son who loves his parents. I'm also keenly aware that when their generation goes, a living memory of the essential fragility of society will go with them. The Western world, Northern America, Europe, has never in my lifetime been torn apart by war or economic collapse. And so I think many of us, maybe most of us who are younger than a certain age, have this ingrained feeling that it just could never happen here. We take peace and stability for granted, just like we take central heating or laws against child labor for granted. And I think people on all sides of this political spectrum take a lot of things for granted, and these mutual blind spots really contribute to a lot of the polarization that we see today. But here's why I'm sharing all this. The big story for my parents' generation, like pretty much every generation going back thousands of years, maybe it's the oldest story of civilization, was the fight against tyranny. And here I mean the old school tyranny, the kind of tyrants who wanted everyone else to be their servants and slaves and killed anyone who disagreed with them. I'm going to oversimplify here by saying that first there were kings and popes and emperors and czars. Then came the Nazis. After that, it was communist Russia and generals or dictators throughout the developing world. And against all that was Western democracy, which equaled freedom, which was relatively new and very precious after World War II. And yes, Western democracy was also built on the proceeds of a brutal colonialism. It had its own dark histories. But in spite of that, it was this fragile new flower that everyone recognized the beauty of. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and it seemed like yet another tremendous blow against tyranny. Freedom had finally won. There were no more constraints. And so we celebrated that freedom, understandably enough, because it meant the freedom for women to vote, or for different people, for people of different skin color and sexual orientation to marry or hold office. It meant the right to say whatever you wanted about your government without fear of reprisal. I grew up in that world. And like any kid, I viewed my surroundings as the natural order of things. Prosperity was intimately bound up with the free world that I was born in, and that also seemed inevitable. Things like public education and healthcare and running water and 3 meals a day, these were all as natural as leaves on a tree. And I wasn't rich, I was average, I was middle class. A house and a car and a wide open future, that was freedom. But there was another side to that coin. Freedom also meant the freedom to exploit the natural world at will, to take as many fish from the ocean as we wanted, to log as many trees as we wished from the forest, to dig up and burn as much oil and gas as we desired. If some First Nation claimed a landscape for themselves or had another vision for it, well, they were uncivilized and needed to be assimilated. And if a non-Indigenous person suggested that maybe there should be some limits as to how much we can extract and consume, well, anyone who suggested these things was very quickly labeled a communist or a socialist or a Luddite, someone who wanted to drag society back into the Dark Ages. That's if they were noticed at all. So that's the world I came of age in. And I always loved stories. As a little kid, I loved reading, and then I started getting older, and I started to read the news, and I loved the news. I read the news like it was a big adventure story. And one of the first big news stories that I can remember was the collapse of the East Coast cod fishery in 1992. I was in high school. We just fished them all out of the ocean, the cod. They were just gone. I don't know if you recall from that time, but a strange thing was that right up until the cod collapsed, new radar technology was helping fishing fleets haul in ever bigger catches. And so the fishermen and industry and even many of the politicians pointed to these catches as proof that the fish were doing just fine. There was nothing to worry about. And so in this way, the cod fishery's best year was also its last. It didn't go off incrementally, it just fell off a cliff. And so it always seemed to me that the big story of my generation was not going to be about war or empire or some military adversary that was coming to kill us all. No, it was going to be about the environmental crisis. And already by that time, the biggest story by far was climate change, or global warming as we called it then. And it's not, I wasn't clairvoyant or even especially passionate about the environment back then. It's just that climate change was big news already then in the early 90s. George Bush Sr. had campaigned on a promise to replace the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Everyone knew about it. It was a bipartisan issue that made headlines all the time. But then over the course of the 1990s, freedom took over and prosperity exploded. And popular culture kind of forgot to worry about the environment. It became a niche issue because every time somebody brought it up, the economists could point to all the wealth around us and say, what are you worried about? So what if Newfoundlanders can't go fishing anymore? There's plenty of jobs in the oil sands. And back then, it was still possible to look at something like the extinction of cod on the East Coast and see it as an unfortunate mistake, unconnected to any larger trends. And certainly that's how it was treated by the general public, even if there was an increasing number of those kinds of mistakes being made. The 1990s were a party decade. Economies grew, the stock market roared, the going was good, and any setbacks were temporary. And then the millennium rolled around and along came 9/11. Suddenly, freedom was under attack. It wasn't good for the environmental movement, I can tell you that. I happened to graduate, whereas before the going was too good to worry about climate change, now the going was too bad. And there was more important things to worry about than glaciers or atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. I happened to graduate from university 2 months after 9/11. And I spent most of the next decade living and reporting abroad. I lived in places like Oaxaca and Nairobi, Peru and Colombia. I traveled through Zimbabwe, and Burma and China, many other places. I was introduced to poverty and corruption and repression and political violence in places that had either very recently emerged from dictatorship or were still in the midst of it. And that gave me a new appreciation for all the progress that our global village has made. Because life isn't just better for the middle class in Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand. I mean, literally all of Latin America was under the thumb of dictatorship when I was born in the 1970s. And now, every one of those dictatorships has been replaced by a democracy. Messy and imperfect for sure, but much better than before. And Asia was dominated by war and famine when I was born. Now there's a huge middle class and it's growing. China alone has lifted 500 million people out of grinding poverty. And that's not to excuse the terrible things that are happening there today, but it is an essential part of their story. As for life here in Canada, we're living in what our ancestors could only have regarded as an age of miracles. I mean, my wife and daughter and I, we flew through the sky in a winter storm to get here. We didn't suffer a moment's discomfort. Speaking of my family, my wife delivers babies for a living. That's just another realm of unambiguous advance. Maternal and infant mortality are orders of magnitude lower today than they ever were before. Not just in Canada, all over the world. Everybody's catching up. My daughter just turned 7. Thanks to being born here and now, she can do whatever she wants with her life. That's increasingly true for women and girls all around the globe. 100 years ago, my wife would not have been allowed to vote, and my daughter would have had to fight like hell just to get an education, let alone a professional career. And this progress is thanks to the struggles of the generations of the women in this room, including my daughter's mother and grandmothers who are also here tonight. And so I thank all of you women personally for the struggles that you have made to make my daughter's life better. I don't take it for granted, and one day neither will she. So I say all this because my own tribe, the environmental community, has a tendency to ignore these gains of the modern world. And the problem with that is the moment you start to take these kinds of gains for granted, they start to slip away. There's a sentiment in certain corners of the environmental movement that civilization is itself the problem, or capitalism is the problem, and the solution is just to burn it all down, torch the institutions, fire all the politicians, and let's start over from scratch. It's been kind of amazing now in recent years to see the same message coming from the conservative movement, although for very different reasons. But no matter where it comes from or for what reason, I couldn't disagree more with that message. I've been very fortunate to know a few politicians who are fighting very hard to correct course and reform the system from within, including the wonderful member of parliament for this riding, Heather McPherson. And I have a huge amount of respect for the job that she and many others like her have taken on. They have to engage all the competing interests in their community, manage the immense complexity of a city or a province or a country. It's a nearly impossible task, even without an environmental crisis. But of course, there is an environmental crisis. And for every politician like Heather McPherson, it seems there's another who denies that there's any such crisis at all. And the worse that crisis gets, the louder their denial grows. None of this is new, but it's getting closer and closer to home, bigger and more dangerous every day. When I was in my 20s, even in my 30s, climate change was about the future, about other places than here. It would affect polar bears in the Arctic, or maybe the residents of low-lying Pacific islands. But now, I'm 45, and it is here. Just in the last 5 years, climate change has really and truly arrived on our doorstep. British Columbia, where I live now, is on the forefront of that. We saw it last year with the heat domes and the fires and the floods that literally tore our province to shreds, killed hundreds of people, displaced tens of thousands more, and cost us billions of dollars. And this fall, just last month in October, we had an unprecedented drought that dried up our salmon streams at the height of spawning season and shrouded Vancouver in wildfire smoke in the middle of October. I'm sure you heard about all this, just as you heard about the devastation in other parts of the world this summer. In Europe, a drought so severe that the Rhone and the Danube dried up completely. In China, the worst drought and heat wave combination in the Earth's recorded history. In Pakistan, a third of the country plunged underwater. None of this has ever happened before. Yes, there have always been hurricanes and droughts and fires and floods, but not at this scale and frequency. And even for somebody like me who's been thinking about this stuff and writing about this stuff for 20 years, it's shocking when it shows up on your doorstep in the flesh. It's so shocking that a very popular response is to downplay it or to deny it completely. And again, this denial did not just spring up in the last 5 years. It didn't just jump out of a box. It's been building all of my life in tandem with the impacts of environmental destruction. The vested interests behind that denial have spent the last half century or so depicting any attempt to limit our environmental footprint as an attack on our freedom to make money mostly, but also our freedom to say whatever we want, or do whatever we want, or buy whatever we want. More oil, bigger trucks, cheaper flights, cheaper meat, cheaper gas. Anyone who pushes back on this is someone who hates freedom and prosperity. Never mind that the entire southwest of the United States is running out of groundwater, or that the glaciers whose meltwater irrigate much of humanity's farmland will soon be gone, or that we have depleted over half the ocean's fish in my lifetime. What matters, according to this narrative of denial, is freedom. And this is a powerful narrative. It borrows from the legitimate fear of actual tyranny, which of course was never fully eradicated, any more than polio or the measles were. There are still plenty of dictators in the world, as you don't need me to tell you. Their power is growing, and not just that, their allure is growing. And that is the really weird thing. The really weird thing about this freedom tribe is that they seem to love tyrants. from Putin on down. Bolsonaro, they have lots of nice things to say about these tyrants. Because tyrants may not let you criticize them in the newspaper or protest their climate policies in the streets, but at least they won't force you to get vaccinated against COVID. And so climate denial and freedom worship were already well in place when COVID-19 arrived. But man, the pandemic really put that narrative on steroids. I mean, nothing could have given the freedom crowd more ammunition than the very real curbs on our freedom that governments around the world imposed to save lives. Pandemic restrictions were the biggest public relations boost the freedom fighters could have dreamed of. And so the same crowd that denies climate change, that denies any connection between the well-being of civilization and the biosphere, that crowd has used exactly the same logic to paint vaccines and public health measures as vicious attacks on our liberty. And all that now is bound up with the denial of climate change. So I've been saying they and speaking in general terms here, but this is not an abstract exercise. The characters are not nebulous or far away and unknowable. 1 kilometer away from here, from this very lecture hall, is Alberta's legislature, where the Premier's office is now occupied by the living embodiment of everything I've just described. Danielle Smith's very first statement as Premier was to describe the unvaccinated as the most discriminated against group that she's ever witnessed in her lifetime. And a few days after that, she put Sonia Savage in charge of the Ministry of Environment. And Sonia Savage, of course, is pretty much synonymous with the oil industry. I mean, when she was energy minister a couple of years ago, right as the pandemic started kicking in, I remember her saying, well, this pandemic is going to be great for new pipelines because now the protesters can't gather and stop them from being built. Danielle Smith herself was a paid lobbyist before she became Premier, paid lobbyist for the oil and gas industry. She campaigned on her refusal to let Ottawa tell Albertans what to do, by which she mostly meant the carbon tax or anything that might constrain production in the oil sands. And Danielle Smith's predecessor, Jason Kenney, of course, paved the way for all of this. It was Jason Kenney who tried to criminalize the entire environmental movement in this province by launching a public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns. That inquiry, as you may recall, was focused on the supposed illegal foreign funding that environmental groups like the Pembina Institute were illegally collecting. And of course, after 2 years of searching high and low, the inquiry found zero evidence of bad conduct. They didn't even note the irony that the oil sands themselves are mostly foreign funded and owned, or that 75% of the profits from those oil sands flow out of Canada to the foreign shareholders. And then there's Danielle Smith's federal counterpart, Pierre Poilievre, who famously stood with the freedom convoy that descended on Ottawa in February. Now, they were there to protest vaccine mandates, sort of. Really, they were protesting the idea that there should be any limits on their freedom to do whatever the hell they want. 2 years earlier, the same organizers behind the Freedom Convoy had launched the Yellow Vest protest that descended on Ottawa as well. Only then it was to shout about the carbon tax. And Pierre Poilievre was there then too, shaking hands with the Yellow Vesters. Poilievre has built his entire movement on the idea that climate action and indeed any kind of environmental protection is an assault on our freedom. His battle cry is "Axe the tax." He claims the carbon tax is the reason for all this inflation, and never mind about oil prices or supply chains. Danielle Smith believes the same thing, or she says she does. And of course, they're far from alone. Their Republican counterparts have been saying all the same things and much worse just south of the border. And right now, as I speak, votes are being counted in the midterms. We're going to emerge into the night after this and we'll learn what's going down. Please don't check your phones right now. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. We could just stay here and have a party after or something. I'm genuinely scared to find out. So honestly, not to state the obvious, but this is a crazy time to be alive. There's drama everywhere. It's unfolding in real time right before our eyes. And not just out there somewhere, but right here. It's impacting our own lives. Just ask the citizens of Ottawa who lived through the convoy. Ask British Columbians who have endured heat domes and forest fires and catastrophic flooding. Now you poor Albertans have Danielle Smith flirting with separatism or privatizing healthcare or God knows what on any given day. You know how it feels to me? It feels like we've just kind of been watching an action movie at home, and all of a sudden the actors have jumped through the screen and now they're in the living room with us. We're part of the movie now. Only instead of actors, it's wildfire smoke coming through the window, or water from a river that's burst its banks and is now seeping under the doorway, or heating and grocery bills that just went through the roof because Russia's latest dictator launched a war on the other side of the planet. It's a crazy time to be alive. But don't worry, it's also an exhilarating time to be alive. It is. I've described some of the awful things that are happening, but it's also true that many incredibly hopeful things are happening at exactly the same time. Let me give you a few examples so you believe me. One of them is the Brazilian election that just happened last week, replacing Bolsonaro with Lula. Arguably a bigger deal than whatever happens tonight in the US. At least now the Amazon has a fighting chance. But the biggest, to me the biggest, and the most spectacular piece of good news is how rapidly clean energy technology has advanced in the last decade. It's absolutely shattered even the most optimistic predictions. Batteries are now cheaper, 83% cheaper to make than they were 10 years ago. Wind power is 60% cheaper to make. Solar power is 90% cheaper than it was 10 years ago. That's why solar power is now the cheapest source of electricity in much of the world, especially in the places where it matters, where all the population centers are. 85% of the new energy projects coming online around the world are clean, renewable energy right now. There's more jobs in clean energy today than there are in the fossil fuel sector. These numbers are wild. Clean, renewable energy is no longer just the right thing to do, it's actually the most profitable thing to do. It just makes, you don't have to be good, you can just make money. That's why the world's most ambitious climate policy was just passed in the US under the title Inflation Reduction Act. That's great marketing, but it's also true. Clean energy is actually going to make everything cheaper. And so this is why we've already shaved about 2 degrees of warming off of our worst case climate scenarios. A decade ago, climate models showed business as usual, sending us well over 4 or 5, like between 4 and 5 degrees of warming by the end of this century, which just would have been absolutely game over for everything. Today, the same models have us headed for about 2 to 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So that's still not great. You know, twice 1.2 degrees, where we're at today, is going to be awful. But the point is that we've already bent the curve in half in the last decade, and there's no reason to suppose that it can't keep bending as long as we keep pushing. And so I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that it is not a coincidence that the same decade which saw this explosion of renewable energy also saw an explosion of far-right conservatives running misinformation campaigns and sweeping into power in every province in Canada and around the world, especially in the United States. Did you know there's a green energy boom happening here in Alberta right now? Wind and solar power now provide a quarter of the electricity in this province. They didn't barely exist 10 years ago. It's all happened in the last 10 years, thanks largely to a renewable energy subsidy that Rachel Notley's NDP government put in place when they held power. And of course, Jason Kenney and the Conservatives canceled that subsidy the moment they took power back, but it was already too late. The industry had been seeded, and now it's taking off, propelled by the force of its own economic logic. $4 billion in wind and solar projects have been approved just in the last 3 years. There's no stopping it now. At the same time, the oil sands have also more than doubled their production in the last 10 years, and the industry as a whole is making more money than it's ever made in its history. Shell just posted a third quarter profit of $9.5 billion. Chevron came in at $11 billion. Exxon made $20 billion in 3 months. They're making a literal killing. Because the reason for these record high oil and gas prices is not some puny carbon tax. It's because Vladimir Putin decided to start slaughtering Ukrainians. So let's think about the invasion of Ukraine for a moment. War is hell, and this one is as bad as they get. There's nothing good to say about it. But one good thing that is going to come out of it is how drastically the invasion of Ukraine is accelerating the European Union's transition to clean energy. That continent is now going to decarbonize at least a decade faster than they would have if Putin hadn't cut off much of Europe's gas supply and forced their hand. And this coming decade is the crucial decade for our climate. This is when all the tipping points are either going to be reached or avoided. And so whatever happens in the next 10 years will reverberate through our atmosphere for the next 10,000 years. I'm not being poetic. I'm repeating what the climate science says. Good things can happen from bad things, and bad things can come from good things. The industrial model that pulled my parents' generation out of poverty and gave me such an excellent life is now a direct threat to my daughter's life. So this is a disorienting time, and it's also a race against time. At the same time as renewable energies are coming on stream at an exponential pace, the climate is approaching any number of critical tipping points. The melting of Greenland's ice sheet, the weakening of the jet stream, the flipping of the Amazon basin from rainforest to savanna, the thawing of our own boreal forests, the frozen peatlands. These existential crises are all unfolding in tandem with their solutions. And so I think the fundamental weirdness of that, of the best and the worst things happening side by side, goes a long ways toward explaining the fundamental weirdness of this moment in culture and politics. I don't want to overstate the case here. Environmental issues are not the only issue in geopolitics, not the only factor in geopolitics or in Alberta's politics. Of course, there are plenty of other age-old things in play, from class and inequality to greed and the love of power. Humans have been doing awful things to each other since long before fossil fuels launched the Industrial Revolution. I also don't think that a Europe that runs on wind and solar will suddenly make Vladimir Putin a nice guy to go for tea with. I'm just saying, after centuries of uninterrupted growth, humanity is now crashing into the limits of the planetary ecosystem. And this has never happened before in the history of our species. It's a totally new phenomenon, one that I believe is a root cause of the strange arguments going on all around us. So this brings me back to the question that I started with, which is, what the hell are any of us puny individuals supposed to do about this? How should we respond? How can we respond? So before I attempt to answer that, let me share a quote that I often hear in my lefty activist circles. It comes from Margaret Mead, the legendary American anthropologist of the 20th century. Maybe you've heard this quote too. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So that's supposed to inspire us, of course. But lately I've been thinking, the small group of thoughtful, of committed citizens who have been changing the world in recent years, as often as not, have been people like Donald Trump and Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith, who all represent a minority of their respective jurisdictions, but have proven adept at exploiting loopholes in a system that only works when everybody's operating in good faith. The majority, that's us. We're not a small group of citizens, we're the biggest group. And I'm making a big assumption here that you are among, here in this room, watching online, that you are among the vast majority of Canadians who do take climate change seriously, who do believe vaccines work, who are horrified by the misinformation and outright lies that we're seeing everywhere today, and who are unsure of what to do about it all. So I think we should all take heart from the fact that we have numbers on our side, that kind and thoughtful people are still in the majority. And that's the first thing we can do, is take heart. It sounds trite and vague, and I know it kind of is, but I think it's also essential. The amount of anxiety and frustration that so many people are feeling is becoming a genuine public health concern today. So take heart is not just some hippie verbal hug that I'm trying to wrap my arms around you with. It's concrete advice, because I think we're going to need all the heart that we can get in the coming years. I'm not predicting apocalypse, but I'm also not predicting that utopia is just around the corner. Probably a best case scenario is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, our dear neighbors to the south are really going to make things interesting for us here, probably starting tonight. There's no doubt. So as for the next step, what are we supposed to do with our numbers and all our heart? Don't worry. I'm not exhorting you to march in the streets or run for office or become a vegan, although these are all great options, and I encourage if you want. Honestly, I think if there's one central message I have, if there's one thing I really encourage people to do, it's just this: pay attention and talk to people about what you see. Notice what's going on and put this moment that we're living through in its proper historical context, because this really is an incredible time to be alive. And for all the dark things happening, there really are an equal number of exciting things happening too. We're living through a battle for truth and honesty, which are closely related but very distinct. Other generations in other places have gone through this battle before us. Now it's our turn. And for me, as a writer and a journalist, I see this as a time of narrative trench warfare. It's my story, our story, against the story of people who deny the evidence all around us, who deny that the earth is warming, or that vaccines work, or that society can only function if its members accept reasonable limits to their freedom. And the thing is, you don't have to be a journalist or a politician or an activist to be a part of this struggle. In fact, I think increasingly it doesn't matter who you are or what your station is in life. You can't not be a part of it. Like I said, we are all in the movie now. So just talking about this stuff and seeking truth, if you can't find the truth, looking for honesty, that kind of thing is available to everyone. Again, I'm not here to whip you up into a marching army. I'm not really an evangelist. I probably seem like one sometimes. I'm a person of German descent who's had an excellent life, and I can't help noticing that millions of people, including some of my own friends, are falling under a spell of delusion that bears a chilling similarity to the spell that Germans fell under in my grandparents' time. The specific lies are very different, of course, and the degree of evil remains incomparable. I should be clear, I'm not comparing anyone to Hitler. In fact, one of the weird things about this story is that there's no true cut and dried villains here. Instead of villains, we're up against a collection of inert gases that are totally benign in small concentrations. It's very difficult to get the public worked up about that. And yet, the public is worked up. And to me, that's another huge difference between our time and that of my grandparents. Today, many more millions of people are pushing back against the lies and the conspiracy theories. And that's the thing that gives me hope, that this story does not have to end in tragedy. We are the ones writing it. Speaking out for honesty and compassion and kindness has never been important. And if there's nothing else you can do that. You'll have plenty of opportunities, I'm sure. Because although this is a global story, it's also an intensely local story involving our friends, our families, our river valleys and our forests, our mountains, the very air we breathe. That's what's at stake. The freedom to inhabit a livable world, and for our children and their children to do the same. I wish I was exaggerating. And so the next time this comes up at a dinner party or during an election debate, just remember, those who shout loudest that they're fighting for freedom are almost always the very ones working to take it away. That's all I got for you tonight. I believe we will turn it over to the questions.
Thanks very much, Arno. We're going to turn it over to Q&A now, and we're going to start with a couple of questions from in the room. And our mic runners are Anastasia over here and Ken over here, and they will bring the mic towards you.
Heckling is also welcome. Anything you got. Yeah.
Questions or criticism?
Just derision and criticism also.
That's right.
Yeah, disagreement. Questions are better though.
There's a couple in the middle. Okay, and then two in the middle.
Thank you for your talk. There is a fundamental disconnect with some of the things that you're saying, especially about the truckers' convoy.
Mm-hmm.
When we have a prime minister who stays in $6,000 hotel rooms
Mm-hmm.
and then preaches what they preach, the fundamental disconnect is nobody believes anybody anymore about anything. So I'm a journalist like yourself.
Uh-huh.
We have fallen off the perch in terms of believability.
Yeah.
So who do you trust? Second, I grew up in a community very different from this one. We were the laughingstock of the country, Sudbury.
Sudbury, Ontario.
The only people who cared about us when I was growing up was us. Nobody ever expected us to be anything more than miners' children. So we regreened that place from the ground up. Nobody else helped us. Nobody came to our defense. We were just laughed at as the butt of jokes. So finally, to keep this short, we have a storytelling problem in our country. I can't tell stories in the United States. I live here. It's not very useful right now to line people up and saying, your story is better than my story. What I want to know from a Hegelian point of view, thesis and antithesis, what's the new story? Thank you for listening.
Thank you for the question. So I tried to lay out my version of the story that I'm trying to tell. Everybody has their own story. The problem of trust in journalism today is huge, for sure. There's no doubt. I think every one of us is wrestling with this. We're all sort of speaking to our own echo chambers, and people can either listen to the Globe and Mail or Rebel News or Fox News. And I wish I had a good answer for you. What I can say is I've been a fact checker in my life, and the publications that I write for all have some sort of fact checking going on. And I think a lot of people, and I include many of my own friends in that, have lost all sense of media literacy. And they go on Facebook and they don't know how to tell bullshit from non-bullshit. And it's actually not that hard to do. And there are actually reputable news sources that you can go to for information. And that's kind of the place that I start with, is don't just go to Facebook and believe whatever you read from there. I'm not the first person to say this, it's not original, but the Globe and Mail, the National Post, who I often disagree with, National Observer, the Narwhal, the Tyee, they have fact checkers. They don't just make things up. A lot of these other sources just make things up, and especially the people who are trying to deny that climate change exists or any of this stuff. They're making it up. They're not being fact checked. They're pulling facts out of thin air. So there is actually an objective difference between, there is a truth there that they are denying. As for your history, I'm sorry that you felt that people were a laughingstock in your mining community in Sudbury. I'm genuinely sorry for that. I don't know who was doing the laughing there.
I'm not offended by it.
Well, it seems to have left a mark. So I'm sorry for that. I wouldn't be the one. I think that's a common sentiment in Alberta, that a lot of the oil workers here feel that the whole country is just covering them in scorn. And I think that's a huge problem that the environmental community has had, that they are learning from it lately, but for a long time, they just smeared everybody with the same brush, that they were just people who didn't care about anything. I think that's a huge mistake. So I think the challenge is to embrace the people who work in these industries. That's why we are now working for the woke term for it is a just transition, which is to say the people who work in these industries are human beings with families, and they're not evil people. They want to have good lives and have the same values as the rest of us, but they're trapped just like the rest of us. And so if you're asking me, my message is, let's bring everybody along on this journey and recognize that there are certain industries which are objectively destroying the fabric of the ecosystems that our civilization needs to run. And so how are we going to do that? How are we going to shift away from this without criminalizing people who are really just victims of circumstance, like all of us? So I'm kind of rambling around that question of yours, but that's the best I can do. Like I said, we are in a battle for truth and honesty, and people don't know where to look for the right story. And all I can do is tell the best story that I can and make sure that it's fact checked. And I think media literacy is a big problem today, and that's a big part of this story.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much. That was an excellent lecture. I have just a quick question for you. You didn't mention nuclear energy or the coal industry in Alberta, and I would be very interested in your thoughts on those.
Sure, yeah. Well, we were just talking about nuclear at dinner last night, actually, by chance, with some friends of mine. I'm not an expert in nuclear. I know that small modular reactors, that there's a new generation of nuclear power available. And personally, I am a very big proponent of it. I think it's going to be a key part of the future energy mix. Wind and solar and a lot of other renewables can do a lot of work. As I said, they've been advancing by leaps and bounds, and they have a lot further to go, but there's intermittency problems. So I do think nuclear will be a huge part of the future energy mix. There is, of course, a huge battle with public perception of nuclear to overcome, because people are still associate nuclear with Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. And so there's all this regulatory stuff and public perception, and it's a very dicey political proposition. But I think inevitably, I do think it will be a part of the mix. As for coal, Alberta, the reason that wind and solar now account for 25% of Alberta's energy is because Rachel Notley agreed to phase out coal, and aggressively did that, and did so much faster than anybody thought was possible because of wind and solar. And so, yeah, coal. Sure. Oh, the mic is not on.
Hello. Oh,
There it is.
okay. Hello.
Hi.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your talk tonight. I very much appreciate it. I'm a younger person, part of the millennial Gen Z cusp of generation. I've heard about the climate change crisis growing up, and obviously very aware of it now. Like very much care about it, believe in it. And when I talk to people of older generations, I'm often told to, well, just vote. We can vote the right people in, and we can solve our way through this through voting. In my young life, I've had a lot of experience in Get Out the Vote campaigns, helping mobilize over 35,000 students across Canada to get out to vote. Like, I've seen it, and I've been there, and I've been a part of it. And coming out on the other side, it's really hard for me as a young person to believe in the power of voting actually making policy differences within my lifetime. I have a lot of my friends, discussion table dinner time is not about where we see our careers going once we graduate school. It's about how we're not having kids because we don't believe that we'll be able to have the same summers that we had growing up, and we won't be able to give that to our children. These are very serious, obviously, conversations that are hard to have. We don't have a lot of hope. And so when I look to the older generation, I am told vote, 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 but I'm not seeing policy differences being made in the time that you're talking about of this 10 years, especially when our governments keep committing to hitting climate targets and then never meeting them. We live in a petro state. We see that in our government. We have, as you've mentioned, Danielle Smith is most likely about to get elected tonight in her by-election and is going to lead our province. There's some really terrible stuff with the climate crisis. For the time that she's in government. So I guess my long-winded question is to you, what do you say to us young people who are like, we're tired of hearing just vote. It's not good enough for us anymore. We're out of hope and we're out of patience. Where do we go with this?
Yeah, thanks. My answer is that voting is necessary but insufficient. I think people have to vote. I mean, Donald Trump, you can't tell me there's no difference between Donald Trump and not Donald Trump. And he became president in 2016 because not enough people voted. I live in Vancouver. We just had civic elections that were won. 35% of the population voted for that. I think, ironically, the more local, not ironically, the more like civic city elections and provincial elections, your vote counts for a lot more. And I'm glad that you're voting, and I thank you for bringing out the vote. Still, the number of people who are voting is shockingly low, and I think, I don't know, I don't know, my sense is that for every person like you, there's also another person who thinks, oh, why bother, it doesn't make a difference, the politicians are all the same. The politicians are not all the same. It does make a difference. That said, you're totally right to feel frustrated because voting is not enough. And so I think all the activists I know say vote and then keep pushing and push between elections and force politicians to do what they otherwise might not want to do. And so there's a ton of NGOs. You know, if you want to get involved and if you're frustrated and you're feeling, it sounds like you're a person who is deeply involved, if you've been getting out the vote, there are so many incredible groups out there. Heather McPherson, who I mentioned, is the MP for Edmonton Strathcona. She could use some help. She's fighting the good fight, you know, like there's ways to get involved with her campaign. She would like to do stuff that she can't do because she doesn't have the public support. So, you know, for me, I see my work as doing this kind of thing of trying to like infuse the public with enough urgency that when a politician does come along and try to do something radical or even just aggressive on climate or any other front, they won't get voted out of office. Danielle Smith might get elected tonight, but she's got another election to face this spring. Vote her out. You know, that's going to make a huge difference. A Rachel Notley government may not be, it will be far from perfect, but it would be so much better than a Danielle Smith government. And honestly, I think that is the single most effective thing you can do. Is it going to, like, I don't want to say that, oh, then you can go to bed and the problems will be solved and Rachel Notley will just do it. Absolutely not. You just have to keep pushing. So I feel your frustration. I've been feeling it. We live in a petro state. You're right. I'm here because I feel that frustration, and I think we have to instill that urgency into the public, and there's no one right way to do it. I wrote a book. My book was all about like all the different ways that we can engage with this struggle, and for some people that means marching in the streets. For some people that means running for office. For some people that means donating to the cause that they appreciate. And for some people that, you know, people have lives and jobs and kids and families. Maybe they're just aware and maybe all they can do is vote. So I don't think there's one right answer, but thank you for saying that, because that's the thing that I think about all the time, and I think it's crucial.
Okay, Arno, thank you very much for the talk. It was great, and I'm a huge fan of your books. And for anyone here who hasn't read any of Arno's books, I highly recommend them. They're very readable. You mentioned, and you said the phrase tonight, limits to growth, and I flashed on a book that was written back in the 60s, maybe late 60s, by a group of scientists and academics, and they call themselves, I think, the Club of Rome.
Yep.
Whatever happened to that group and that book and the prognostications that they had made?
Yeah, they're still around. They're old now. For those who don't know, the limits to growth was really a lot of my talk was and a lot of my work has been based on and I forget the year, but it was in the mid 70s, sort of when the environmental movement was really being born. And this group called the Club of Rome, which included former prime ministers and scientists, and is a very influential group. And they did this survey that said, okay, look, there are limits to growth ecologically, and humanity is about to start hitting them. And everybody laughed them out of the room about 5 or 10 years later, because then the 80s and the 90s happened, and life just kept getting better, and everybody said, see, you were wrong. What they predicted was that there comes a tipping point when the Earth, when humanity starts consuming more than the Earth can reproduce, and it would take about 20 or 30 years for humanity to start feeling the impacts of that. So in other words, there was going to be a time lag between when we had passed the point of no return and when we realized that we had passed the point of no return. And one could argue that we have reached that point of no return. But as for what they're doing, I don't know what the individual members are up to right now. I would say that their predictions were not wrong. They were borne out, and we're starting to see all kinds of things collapsing all around us right now. Yeah.
Talk, lots of food for thought there. I have a simple question. Would you live near a small nuclear reactor?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I know it's a good question,
I would
that's
want to
why I
do some more research about it. It's actually something I need to learn more about. But I think the answer is yes. Yeah, I do perhaps naively trust my government in this country to have the safeguards in place to do it correctly. I do trust that small nuclear reactors are a heck of a lot safer. Yeah, but that's exactly as soon as somebody says, "Oh, do you want it in your backyard?" then your hackles go up and you get nervous. But genuinely, I would say that I would. Yeah, I really do trust our government to put the right regulations and to be careful about doing that. Maybe not in Alberta. I don't live here. I live in BC. Yeah.
Thank you. Part of being an informed electorate and getting everyone out to vote is having access to good information, having fact checkers. And a lot of the misinformation or false information that's out there is freely available, but some good information is paywalled or difficult to get to. So how do we balance the getting good information to the electorate while making sure that we can still, have that good information being paid for by or being provided by journalists who are getting paid?
Yeah, that's tricky. It's no secret that journalism has gone through just a very terrible couple decades, and the whole profit model has just gotten sucked out from under it. But I think now, from the ashes of what used to be a very successful, profitable industry, there are a lot of new publications coming up that have totally different funding models, and there's too many of them to go into. But I can say that some of the outfits that I write for in British Columbia, like the Tyranny and the Narwhal, they're free and they are fact checked and they are public and they have, they pay reasonably well. Others that I write for, like the Globe and Mail and the National Observer, do have firewalls or paywalls, I should say. It's a bit of a conundrum. On the one hand, I recognize that people need access to good information. On the other hand, it's what other commodity is there that people expect to get for free? Nothing really, right? So as a journalist, as a person who's trying to make his living doing this, it's hard to strike that balance, we can't just do everything for free. Especially in my view, this is a very valuable resource. So it doesn't seem crazy to ask people to pay a few dollars a month for a subscription or a few cents for a particular article. But I recognize that there's so much out there to read and money's tight. So I'm not trying to say, I have articles every once in a while somewhere that something will come up and I want to read it, but I don't have a subscription to that. And so I'm like, oh man, I don't want to, so I feel you. I think the answer is find a few that you like. I think the Globe and Mail is a very good newspaper and no bias here, but there's others, that you can choose them and pick a couple good ones that speak to your interests and speak your language and pay for them, and that's good. Yeah.
Good evening. One quick question. What issues do you see in terms of renewable energy, in terms of how it's being rolled out and how hard it's being pushed? Do you see us being set up for failure?
Well, so I feel like there's two parts to that question, almost subtexted, that are there consequences to renewable energy? And yes, there are. Solar and wind, I don't know if that's what you meant, but some people feel, well, solar, has this huge, all the things we have to mine to dig that up, and wind power too. They have their own environmental footprints, and of course nuclear, and all those things are true. My short answer is the big thing that we have to figure out and solve urgently is climate change, and I think that trumps all the other things. Yeah. Well, we'll be causing different issues. So mining and creating renewable energy is not going to exacerbate the climate crisis. It will solve the climate crisis. No, not really. No, I would, if you're talking about electric vehicles, there is an argument, I don't think a billion Teslas, replacing a billion internal combustion engines with a billion Teslas is gonna solve much. I think the answer is more public transit and car shares and all those kinds of things. So I'm not an advocate of yes, batteries, electric cars are gonna save everything. I think the climate crisis is just, it's beyond, I think, what even I can really comprehend. It's coming down so fast. I think that just trumps everything else. I don't think that means we should not worry about those other environmental impacts. I think we should, and people are. And a lot of those, like even in battery technology, they're learning to make batteries with iron instead of lithium. And that isn't working yet, but they're working on that, you know? And so rest assured, very intelligent minds are very aware of these secondary issues, and they're working on them. So I don't know if that's what you meant. Then the other part to me is, well, how do we get governments to deploy these renewable technologies? I live in British Columbia. We have a government that is pretty progressive, but is also quite beholden to especially natural gas interests. And they could be much more aggressive about providing subsidies for things like heat pumps for homes, boosting transit. They could be doing all kinds of things that they're really kind of lukewarm on right now. And again, I think that's just public urgency. And if they felt that the public really, really wanted it, then they would push it. And so that's where I see my job, is to convince people that, yes, this is urgent and it's worth it. And it will actually save us money in the long run. Yeah.
Is this on? Yeah, we got a question from the online audience, and then we'll go to the middle here, Ken. So Arno,
Okay.
the people on Zoom want to know.
Zoom wants to know.
Zoom wants to know, can you please comment on the argument that Canada's impact to climate change is trivial compared to China, India, and the US? How can the global village solve the climate crisis without major commitments from the big three?
I can comment on that, yes. Thank you for the question. It comes up a lot. I think about my daughter, who was 7 years old, and if everybody in her class was causing mayhem, and she said to me, well, it doesn't matter if I stop causing mayhem, the rest of everybody will, I would tell her, fuck those other people. You're responsible for yourself, and stop causing mayhem. And that's my answer here. No, Canada cannot single-handedly solve the climate crisis. But if we are the world's 4th biggest producer of oil and gas, so if you think that we don't have an influence on what happens with the global trajectory, then I don't know who will. No one country can solve this thing. This is a collective action problem, and it only gets solved if everybody collectively acts on it. And if everybody says, well, it doesn't matter if I don't do my part because I'm too small to matter, if everybody says that, then guess what? We won't solve this thing. But if everybody basically pretends that what they do matters, then all of a sudden it does matter, and we solve it.
Hello? Okay. So thank you, Arno, for the talk. I want to bring economics and economists.
I'm an environmentalist. I don't speak that language.
But you should.
I'm joking.
But
please.
you should,
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Because for centuries, we have been taught that the village must grow. And we must keep growing the village. And any politician that will do anything to stop the village from growing will be marched out of office, right? In Edmonton, we are advertising across the country to move more people to Alberta right now, right? You have those advertisements running in airports across the country because the village must keep growing. And this is universal. It's preached by economists around the globe. You read any article on from an economist about a country where the population is about to shrink, and they say, you must solve this problem. You must increase the number of people that's born in your country, or you must bring new people in. So I think that going back to the limits of growth, it's not so much the limits of growth, but have a rational look into growth and have a vision for being stable or shrink the village.
Yeah, thank you. You have touched on a foundational issue for the environmental movement. I'm probably not the first person to stand here or to tell you that pursuing infinite growth on a finite planet does not make rational sense. But that is indeed the model that has gotten us to where we are today with excellent results. So a couple things come to mind. First of all, there's a difference for an affluent country and a very poor country. I think poor countries where the median income is like, $10 a day or whatever, they have room to grow. But affluent countries of the West, where the median income is much higher, we have the biggest responsibility to figure out how to manage our, reach stability instead of keep growing. The world population is itself leveling off. We are about to level off, definitely by the end of this century, probably well before, at around 8, 9, 10, well, we're at 8 billion now, so people are predicting it's going to level off at 10 billion. So that has never, ever happened before in the history of humanity. That presents all kinds of challenges. Countries like Japan, many of you have probably read about, they are grappling with how do we, there's going to be this big bubble of aged people who, and then this tiny little workforce. And so it creates all of these real economic issues that you're right, we can't just ignore as environmentalists. Canada's population is actually declining except for immigration. The only reason we're still growing is because we have immigration. In ecological terms, I see this as a good thing because the world cannot keep sustaining infinite growth of human population. So the fact that we're leveling off is something to celebrate. And now we have to figure out, like you say, how can we create long-term sustainable prosperity without adding growth all the time? I don't have an easy answer for that. I can point out that some of the oldest and most successful corporations that are hundreds and even in some cases over 1,000 years old are in Japan. And the reason that they have flourished so well is because they don't grow. They have found a model to stay stable. They don't try to become bigger than they were. They deliberately and explicitly resist the temptation to grow. And some of those, these include some of them that build temples, some of them that make tea. It's really fascinating. A friend of mine named James McKinnon, who wrote a book called The Day the World Stops Shopping, and he addresses this question in this book. And so he visits Japan, and he goes to see some of these corporations. And it's really fascinating to see how these corporations that are so ancient, the reason they survived all the ups and downs of the global economy was that they did not try to grow. They reached a certain size of number of employees and output and production, and they felt that that was optimal. And they tend to be family businesses, actually. And they've plateaued there, and they were sustainable for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's a lesson to be learned there. I recognize that you can't just say that and then suddenly it's going to magically happen. There is a genuine issue when population levels off, and then you have a bubble of aging that happens and a smaller workforce that has to take care of a bigger retired community. So that's the issue that this next century that every country in the world is basically going to deal with. And Canada has been dealing with it by bringing in immigrants to keep growing. And maybe that's a good solution. I don't know. But I think you're right you're absolutely right to raise that issue. And it's something that a lot of people think about all the time, myself included.
All right, that's it for the questions. Thank you very much, Arno.
That's it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Arno, for your engaging and thought-provoking talk. I
Thank you.
found it particularly compelling, your inquiry into overall the relationship with our planet. That's the big takeaway for me from your book and your talk.
Yeah.
Very compelling about that. And I'm glad that you actually struck a rare note of optimism.
Thanks.
You
Sneak-
threw out
there's a little bit of
you
it in
threw up
there.
the optimism bomb in
Yeah,
there instead
totally.
of all instead of all doom and gloom. So that was good.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all for attending this evening and for your questions. We this evening have been reminded why this university exists, right? It's a place to learn and teach, to debate and to question, to inspire and be inspired. It's a place to challenge and a place to connect. And I'll add, all in a civilized manner. Thank you to the team of friends who have worked hard making tonight a success. We're all volunteers in this. I thank you all very much for helping us putting this event together and making it happen. And we invite anybody here, thank you, mic runners, Zoom attendants, door greeters, burly door persons, we're all volunteers, and we invite anybody here that wishes to join our ranks to do so. you can visit the website. Again, you don't get asked for money. You get a chance to connect and be informed. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future at other Friends of the University of Alberta events. Thanks, have a good night.